here at the Catholic Information Center in Washington, D.C., and those who are tuning in from across the world, from London to Canada to California. People are excited about Dr. Royal's new book, The Martyrs of the New Millennium. My name is Angelica Tom. I'm the Senior Director of Operations here at the Catholic Information Center, and it's just a delight to have you here. I'll just give you a little gist of the schedule tonight. So Dr. Royal will provide his wonderful talk about his new book, and then that'll be followed by an opportunity to buy the book, get it signed from the illustrious author, and enjoy a light happy hour on this Spy Wednesday. One little FYI, the building is conducting a big maintenance project tonight in the garage here at the 1501 K Street building. Therefore, we'll have to be out by 8 p.m. So we're going to just close up a little earlier at 7:45 during the happy hour, but you'll have plenty of time to just enjoy and have a good cocktail with Dr. Royal. Now about this wonderful new book, The Martyrs of the New Millennium. We're just delighted that you have chosen the CIC to debut the book today, and the book is found in the best Catholic bookstores here in the lobbyist district of K Street. Our dear friend George Weigel wrote, "With this compelling and moving book, Robert Royal continues his noble work as a witness to the witnesses, the martyrs who lived their Christian faith to limits of love by following Christ through death into eternal life and imperishable glory. The Martyrs of the New Millennium is an essential historical reading and rich spiritual fare." Could not agree more. The author, Robert Royal, is the founder and president of the Faith and Reason Institute, of which they celebrated their silver anniversary this year. And he's also the editor-in-chief of the Catholic Thing. He holds a BA and an MA from Brown University and a PhD in comparative literature from the Catholic University of America. He has taught at Brown, Rhode Island College, and the Catholic University of America. He's received fellowships to study in Italy from the Renaissance Society of America as a Fulbright scholar from 1980 to 1982. He served as editor-in-chief of Prospect Magazine in Princeton, New Jersey. He's authored numerous books, including Deeper Vision, the Catholic Intellectual Tradition of the 20th Century. His articles have appeared in numerous scholarly journals and other publications, including First Things, Communio, the Wilson Quarterly, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, National Review, and the American Spectator. That list goes on for pages, so just saving you a little time there. Dr. Royal writes and speaks frequently on questions of ethics, culture, religion, and politics, and he has appeared on various television and radio shows around the United States and throughout the world. So it is my pleasure to introduce the author, Dr. Robert Royal.
Well, I don't know what to say after all that. I wish my mother were here. She would probably believe half of what we just heard. I want to thank Angelica and everybody here at the CIC for putting together this evening. This center, as probably all of you know, either if you're here or if you're watching online, is a beacon of light here in Washington, D.C. And I don't think I'm exaggerating after 30 years living here of saying there aren't too many beacons of light in this town. I want to also commend those of you who've turned out tonight and people who are at home watching this online, because obviously this is not a subject that you approach expecting to be deeply entertained for the rest of the evening. It in many ways might look lugubrious to talk about people who are persecuted and even murdered. But I have to say that there's a way in which the Catholic martyrs are also a beacon of light. And I hope to convince you of that, or at least suggest that to you by the time that we're finished. Just a very quick anecdote, as I'll explain in a minute. I actually wrote a similar book in the year 2000 called The Catholic Martyrs of the 20th Century. And I gave, of course, many lectures about that book. And after one lecture, a woman got up and she asked me, "Weren't you depressed reading about all these terrible things that happened to Catholics during the 20th century?" And I looked at her and I said, "You know, that has never crossed my mind. That in fact, I was reading about these heroic people, these holy and heroic people, sometimes unknown to themselves to be actually heroic in that way, until the moment of truth came about." So to spend that much time with wonderful human beings who actually pray for and forgive the people who are about to kill them, This is not something to mourn over too much. Of course, we mourn in a way. But in another way, it is a great witness that it's worth being in contact with, and I'm glad that you're here this evening with me. Now, I think that an awful lot of even Christians think that martyrdom is a thing of the past, or at least a very rare occurrence in the modern world. It is not. And I tried in this book to provide a kind of a representative sampling of martyrdom since the year 2000. But it can only be a sampling and representative because the subject is so large. I mean, this book isn't a big book. It's about almost 300 pages, but it could easily be 3 times as long. And in fact, I finished the writing of it mid to late November. And since then, there are enormous numbers of Catholics who have been persecuted and martyred all around the world. Nigeria alone, if you follow this at all, you probably know about Nigeria. Nigeria alone has about 5,000 Christians a year who are killed by either radical Islam or Christian Muslim tensions within the country. So, if you just took past years as a kind of a guide, it's probably the case that in Nigeria alone, 2,000 Christians have been killed since I finished writing this book. And Nigeria isn't the only place where you could say that such things are happening. My son sent me just the other day that on Palm Sunday in Nigeria, 51 Christians were killed in a single attack on a church. And this is a matter of, as we'll see, radical Islam, which has broken out in many parts of the world, that characteristically attacks Catholics, Catholic institutions, Catholic churches on Christian holy days, Palm Sunday, Easter, and Christmas in particular. Now, I'm not going to say much about practicalities, but let me just say one thing about Nigeria in particular, since it produces the largest body count of any single country in the globe. Under the Biden administration, the Nigerian government was removed from the countries of particular concern. If you follow these things, it's CPC, it's called. I don't know why exactly, maybe because Nigeria has a lot of oil, it's a mineral-rich country, et cetera, but it was removed. And if there's anything that the Trump administration could do to sort of set out a marker for what it thinks about religious persecution, it would be to at least put Nigeria back on the CPC list as soon as possible. Any of you involved in being able to do that, I encourage you to try to transmit that to the White House. Now, Nietzsche says somewhere that every idea has its autobiography. Hadley, you probably know what book that is in. I can't remember where I read it. I don't know if that's true, but I want to just quickly go over the 2 books that I've written, why it is that the 2 books were written and why it is that they're different, because I think it'll help explain the situation of Christian persecution and martyrdom at this point in the 21st century. As I said, I wrote a similar book in 2000. I gave a copy of it to John Paul II on May 7, 2000, and that was a day that he had a celebration for all the Christian martyrs of the 20th century at the Colosseum. Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant. It was a vast celebration just outside the Colosseum and quite inspiring and a good look back at what had happened during the 20th century. I had no intention of writing this book, I have to say, but the Aid to the Church in Need, which has been close with us at the Faith and Reason Institute and working on various projects, asked me to do a second edition of that book. And it only took me about 5 minutes to decide. It was just too hard to go back and rewrite a book. Much easier to write an entirely new book on the 25 years of the 21st century to this point. So the difference between these 2 books in a nutshell is this. In 2000, if you looked back at the 100 years of persecution and martyrdom of Christians, the body count was largely produced by atheist totalitarianism. And it was communism to the largest extent, I mean, far surpassing Nazism, fascism, etc. Various communist regimes in the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact countries, China, of course, is always the biggest of anything because of the population size. And China is still a very serious persecutor, as I'm sure that all of you know. But things have shifted a bit since that focus, that kind of atheist totalitarianism of the 20th century, which was organized and had instantiated itself in various regimes. When I wrote that book, 9/11 hadn't taken place yet. Now, radical Islam predates 9/11 by a long shot. You probably know that the World Trade Towers were attacked by an Islamic bomb even back in the 1990s. Didn't succeed very well, but there was an attack. A bomb went off. And of course, there were lots of other attacks as well. Radical Islam has long roots and complicated roots, but suffice to say that Sayyid Qutb, an Egyptian radical, is basically the founder of the ideology of radical Islam. And just an interesting side note, he became extremely radicalized when he came to the United States and saw the corruption of our morals and manners in 1950. God only knows what he would have thought if he came, now 75 years later. It's not as if governments back then were friendly toward this radical Islam. In fact, Qutb himself was executed by the Egyptian government. But it began to develop all over the place. Osama bin Laden, the mastermind of 9/11, was a kind of a radical Islamist. And if you want, in a nutshell, what the difference is between the 20th century in terms of Christian martyrdom and the 21st century, there's a sentence of Salman Rushdie. You probably know him. He's an Indian or Pakistani English author who writes primarily in English, as I understand it. After he wrote his novel, The Satanic Verses, which was very, very controversial in the Islamic world, the Iranian leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, issued a fatwa calling for the murder of Salman Rushdie. Well, fortunately for him, he was living in England at the time. Margaret Thatcher was the prime minister. She was a very strong defender of free speech, and nothing happened to him until 30 years later. He was stabbed and almost killed here in Chautauqua, New York, by a radicalized Muslim. He lost one eye. And he said afterwards, let me just quote this properly. He said afterward, after having overcome fascism, Nazism, and Stalinism, the world now faces a new totalitarian threat, Islamism. Now, look, we know that most Muslims, like most people in most religions, are peaceful. And it's a bit, at least here in the United States, where the numbers of Muslims aren't as high as they are, for example, in the European nations these days. We all try to live and let live, get along with one another. We believe in pluralistic religious societies. But I think we have to point out that we can't understand what's going on in the world unless we truthfully face the kind of mayhem that's being perpetrated. And as I'm going to try to explain to you, not solely in places like the Middle East or Africa or Asia, but somewhat in the West as well. So we have to recognize this for what it is. Now, I want to take just a couple minutes to talk about what a martyr is. You probably think you know what a martyr is, but the more you kind of look into the idea of martyrdom, there actually are some things that are worth parsing out. Now, most of us, when we think about martyrs, we have an image in the back of our heads of the early martyrs in the Roman Empire, in which Christians are thrown to the lions, they're horribly tortured, burned on grills, and all sorts of other things that happen. But if you look at this carefully, it's called in Latin in odium fidei, in hatred of the faith. But if you look at carefully what even those early martyrs were suffering for, it wasn't like the Romans had a different theology. I mean, they broadly thought that there was an insult to the pagan gods, to the Roman gods, to the gods that had made Rome great in this Christianity, which was growing rapidly in the Roman Empire. But others were able to get along with the Roman system without a problem. Jews, for example, decided that they would pray for the emperor. They wouldn't worship him. They wouldn't burn incense, and got along fine. But the Romans always were concerned about public order. And they perceived the Christians, who were really adamant in not succumbing to even just pro forma worship of the emperor, they perceived that to be a threat to public order. And eventually, of course, it was. Eventually, the entire Roman Empire became Christian. But I want to point out that it's not as if this was a theological clash entirely. That's what the older system was. And as I say, that's in odium fidei. That's the classic example. Now, we have plenty of examples of that in the modern world. I talked about the kinds of things that we see in these totalitarian regimes. Even there, I don't know that it's so much a matter of a theological, atheism versus Christianity, as it is a recognition that Christianity and other religions are a threat in the sense that they represent a different value system, a different body of worshipers who can resist the kinds of things that the state might try to impose on them. So we still have some of that, obviously, in places like China. Korea is a terribly repressive communist regime, the most repressive regime. We don't even have good data about what's happening to Christians in Korea, if there even are any. And if you look here in the Western Hemisphere, in Cuba, in Venezuela, and in Nicaragua incredibly in recent years, are ramping up repression of the Catholic Church in particular, because the Catholic Church, being a large institution, represents a kind of a institutional alternative to the regime. Nicaragua in particular has, the Ortegas go all the way back to John Paul II in the 1980s, visiting Managua, when, if you recall, he had to say, silencio, silencio. They were chanting and trying to stop him during the mass that he had down there. So John Paul II came up with a second category of martyrdom, which he called the nuovi martiri, the new martyrs. And by that, he meant something slightly different than the old form in odium fidei. The nuovi martiri are figures. They could be clerics, they could be lay people, but people who are in circumstances in which they know what's happening in the society around them. They seek to resist some evil on the basis of their commitment to the Catholic faith. It may look to people on the outside as if what they're doing is a political or social thing, but you could take a figure like Oscar Romero in El Salvador, who was not intending to overthrow a regime, but was intending to stand up against the death squads and the other things that were happening to his population. And this may sound a little humorous, but here's an interesting example. Rosario Livatino, who was a lawyer and then later a judge in Sicily. And Livatino, on many occasions, because he was a very firm Catholic, on many occasions publicly announced that what was he was doing because, of course, Sicily needed law and order, but he primarily was doing it because of his commitment to Jesus Christ. And he thought that although he knew he was risking his life, he had to oppose the mob in order to fulfill his obligations to God. So, like a lot of the other anti-mafia police and prosecutors and judges, he was assassinated in Sicily back in the 1990s. We didn't know about this until recently. And he's very much revered by Catholics in Sicily, who obviously still have to confront this sort of lawlessness. And that's what the Nuovi Martiri are. He's someone who knew that he was risking his life. He wasn't being attacked because he was a Catholic, but he had put himself in circumstances that John Paul II, when he came up with this new category, wanted to recognize that exist in our modern world. Now, Pope Francis has brought out a third category of people. Now, I read a lot and I experience a lot over in Rome about what this Pope is doing. I can't claim to entirely understand everything that Francis does after all these years following him. But he deliberately came up with a new category that he also thought was necessary to deal with modern circumstances in which Christians are persecuted and killed. And he calls this oblatio vitae, the offering of one's life. This differs a bit from a person like Rosario in the sense that he worked for many years to oppose the mob and put people in prison and whatnot. The oblatio vitae is more like a spur of the moment offering of your life, right? That you're living in a society, or you're doing things that may get you in trouble with people who don't like what you're doing out of your Catholic faith. But some circumstance presents itself and you are willing to give up your life on the basis of your commitments. And there are many instances of this, but I pulled out this one, Akish Bashir, who was outside a church on Palm Sunday, I think, in Lahore, Pakistan. And a suicide bomber with a vest on was about to enter the church, probably would have killed 1,500 people. And he grabbed him, knowing that the attacker would probably detonate the bomb. And he said, "I will die, but you will not go in." So I think Francis has put his finger on something here. In the documents that he's issued to try to identify this new type of martyrdom, he says it's not martyrdom, that it's an offering of your life that is short of martyrdom. But on the other hand, Akish Bashir did this, and he is on his way to becoming a saint at this moment. So it isn't automatic sainthood, but it's something now even a step further than John Paul went with the... No. Oh, no, yes, he was. He was a Pakistani Catholic. Yeah. Okay. Now, I want to come down to some other concrete cases, but I want you to keep those three categories in mind, right? The old style in odium fidei, the sort of middle nuovi martiri, and then this new category of Francis's oblatio vitae, because you'll see that there's sort of different types of people who are dying for the faith that fit one or the other of those examples. And I want to begin with talking about the Middle East, because obviously that is the most troubled place in the world right now. The Middle East and Central Africa, basically, are the two places because of radical Islam. Now, just to give you a quick history lesson, part of the problem here is the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in 1922 really left a vacuum. And if you know any of the history of the Middle East, what happened after the Ottomans, who are not Arabs, by the way, they're Turks, right? After they collapsed, what happened was a lot of the Arab tribes and strongmen and different groups were vying for power. If you've ever read T.E. Lawrence's The Seven Pillars of Wisdom, or if you've seen that movie, Lawrence of Arabia, it's a very romanticized idea of pan-Arabism, that there was going to be a uniting of the Arabs in a kind of an Arab state. Didn't happen, and probably it's a good thing it didn't happen. What happened instead was, as the Ottomans were receding, somebody had to maintain order. And so the French and the British came up with the idea of having sort of mandates or protectorates, and the French had Lebanon and Syria, and the British had Palestine and Iraq, and where else am I thinking of? And Jordan, of course, yeah. So as those regions tried to become actual countries, obviously even the borders didn't really correspond to anything that we would regard as a nation. You know, there's a lot of debate over what are Palestinians? Is Palestine a nation? Well, it never was historically, but you could kind of identify a group of people. What that led to after the 1950s, 1960s, as these countries became independent, is chaos, basically. Christians had existed, kind of uncomfortably under the Ottomans. Millions and millions of Christians, especially in Syria and Iraq and elsewhere. But with that disorder, some of the social tensions that kind of were manageable under the Ottomans, they really kind of just exploded. And so you started to see Christians leaving. It happened in every country. It happened even in Israel, that Bethlehem, which used to be something like 80% Catholic and Christian, is now probably in the mid-teens in terms of Christians there. Lebanon is a very interesting case. If you've been following the Middle East these days, Lebanon was set up to be a pluralistic nation in the way that we kind of think of as pluralism. The large majority of Lebanese, when they became independent from France, were Catholics, probably about 60%, maybe even more. But the government that was set up to recognize the various religious groups. And so the president was always supposed to be a Maronite Catholic, the vice president a Sunni Muslim, let me just make sure I have this exactly right. The prime minister would be a Shia Muslim, and then the Speaker of the House would be an Orthodox Christian. It was a optimistic arrangement, to say the least. It lasted for a while, became unstable, civil wars resulted. And what we have now, if you follow this at all, and I'm sure you know, is that Hezbollah, which is a radical Islamic movement with support from Iran, has infiltrated the highest levels of government, the education system, the military, the culture. And so we have a country that should have been a model of, as Pope Benedict XVI said about it, it should have been a model of tolerance in the Middle East, became very quickly a disaster. I want to talk a little bit about Iraq, because a lot of us are familiar with it because the United States invaded Iraq a couple of times, and we have paid attention, and we have kind of a more lively sense of that country's difficulties and our difficulty in keeping order in a place like Iraq than might be the case for other places. I mean, Syria just had a change of regime, and a lot of us are very worried about what's going to happen to there are not nearly as many millions of Christians in Syria as there once were, but we're very worried about the ones who are there because the current president, the interim president himself, was a terrorist years ago, a designated terrorist, and now is a president of a Middle Eastern country. I want to just take a couple examples that will give you kind of a sense of what a lot of other people endured in the Middle East. Okay, we saw him. Here are two very interesting people, Bishop Paulus Farara and Ragid Ghani. Father Ghani was a priest in the Diocese of Mosul that the bishop was the bishop of. And both of them were assassinated shortly after the American invasion of Iraq, a couple of years after the invasion. My Father Ghani was really quite a man. He was sent to Rome by Aid to the Church in Need. He studied there. He got a PhD. He spoke 4 or 5 languages. When he went back to Iraq, he was immediately made the bishop's secretary, and it was clear that he was going to be one of those leaders who would have connections with the West, wanted peace for his people, wanted to protect his people as well. And therefore, in the kind of crazy logic of the clash between radical Islam and Christianity, became a target. He had a Chaldean Catholic church in in Mesopotamia, which is a historic region. And it's a historic region where there were a lot of Christians and a lot of biblical history, going back to Jonah and et cetera. So with the rise of ISIS, or ISIL, the Islamic State in the Levant, a large number of Christians found themselves under attack by what seemed to be a growing and possibly unstoppable movement for a radical Islamic caliphate, that they really wanted to go back and found a caliphate in the way that they thought that it had emerged immediately after the life of Muhammad. And the caliphate that they were looking for was not just a caliphate in the Middle East. If you followed it back in those days, it was a worldwide caliphate. And there are still multiple groups around the world, in Asia as well as in Africa and in the Middle East, who still think it's going to be possible someday to produce an Islamic caliphate again. So Bishop Raho, Paulus Raho, was one of these figures who I kind of regard as falling into that category of the nuovi martiri. He knew what the problems were, but he was an Iraqi who was committed to his own people. And so he was aware of the daily dangers. He was quite brave in participating in public events. But the thing that really, I think, got him murdered was the fact that he opposed the new Iraqi constitution because it kind of imposed Sharia law. And he could see that Christians would be second-class citizens as a result of that. And again, if you were talking about Novi Martyri, he's making a case of what might look like a political argument, but in fact, in his case, and maybe in the case of many others publicly, is a principled Christian argument that Christians deserve respect because we're all made in the image and likeness of God. And he found himself kidnapped. When he was in the trunk of a car, he somehow was able to get his cell phone out, and he told people, don't pay the ransom. That money should be used for people in the church. And his body was found, some weeks after that. Now, Father Ghani, who had a parish up in Mosul, was equally threatened. And in his case, I think it occurs shortly after Benedict's lecture at Regensburg. I don't know if any of you remember that, but his lecture actually was about God being a God of faith and reason. But he used an example from a 15th century Islamic leader that gave the impression that he was saying that Islam was violent and had to be opposed. Now, it was a mistaken reading of what Benedict said. Maybe it wasn't the best example to choose in the early 2000s when the Middle East was heating up everywhere. But what the fallout was is that people like Father Ghani found that the combination of the chaos in Iraq produced by the American invasion, because the Iraqi government and the American forces weren't really in control of what was going on, and then also the backlash over what Benedict had said. He said it was like living in hell. People would send him in envelopes bullets. He was warned repeatedly, close your parish church. And he would tell the figures who came to him and said that, I can't close the house of God. Now, as I said, he was a guy who had studied in Europe. He was given an opportunity to go to Switzerland. He said, how can I leave my people at a moment like this when they're under threat? And so the combination of all those circumstances, again, what I would regard as kind of a Nuovo Martiro situation. By the way, there was a similar thing that happened to a nun in Somalia. A sister, Leoneta Sgorbati was her name. She was a nurse, and she'd established a school for nurses in Somalia. So she wasn't proselytizing, she wasn't a missionary. She was just sort of a medical missionary in the sense that she wanted to bring medical help to the people in Somalia. And she also was killed in the backlash of Benedict XVI's lecture. So anyway, we know for Father Ghani, he and 3 of his bodyguards were gunned down. He left some information, and he said, this will be useful for you when I die. To me, this is quite heroic, that a man, he doesn't know he's going to die today or tomorrow, but he knows that it's going to happen. And he tells his parents, he gives them a photograph, and he says, keep this. You can use this for my funeral. And he said, if anyone who becomes a priest leaves to go abroad, there won't be anybody, presumably any Christians left here. Whatever happens, let it happen. This is one of the reasons why I say reading about these kinds of figures is not depressing. I mean, if you can imagine persons like this, who are just like us, I mean, he's not a military figure, he's not a philosopher, he's just an average priest and kind of an intellectual who finds himself in these circumstances. And things like this were happening all over the Middle East as ISIS was coming to the fore. I want to just mention fast, too, a case that isn't quite martyrdom, I think. I have no authority to declare anybody a martyr. The Vatican has got to do that. But I don't know if any of you remember the case of James Foley, who was an American journalist who was beheaded in Iraq by ISIS. So Foley was a graduate of Marquette University. He's American. He's a very serious Catholic. And he became a war correspondent. Out of what he said was his Catholic conviction that he should show what happens during a war. And this is what happened to him. He went to cover the last days of Gaddafi in Libya, and he was arrested, placed into prison. I think he was only in prison for a few days, but he really found that prayer and his faith helped him there, and so he got through that. He was okay. He then went on to Syria, where he was imprisoned for quite a long time, and eventually he had his head cut off by the Islamic radicals. But I think that this is, although I say this is not quite martyrdom, you have to think about people who are willing to put themselves in circumstances that look like secular activities to many people, but they do it for another reason. This is something we want to be aware of in our societies. Now, I want to move on because I don't want to abuse your time here. Similar things began to happen in Africa. In fact, some people have said that ISIS migrated from the Middle East. Basically, it was suppressed in 2016, 2017. And it moved into some of those fragile countries. Nigeria, I talked about. Nigeria is a particularly difficult case because it's about 50-50 Christian and Muslim. Northern Nigeria is mostly Muslim. Southern Nigeria, there are more Christians than in northern Nigeria. But there have been some inspiring cases there, too. We talked about the bishop. There's Sister Leonela Scorbati. There's James Foley. Here's a really interesting case. This is Michael Nadi, who was a seminarian. He was only 20 years old. And he was kidnapped by some Islamic radicals in the northern part of Nigeria. And they pressured him because they thought he was young and they thought that they could kind of torture him into doing what they wanted. He was given the opportunity to convert or to die. And he lambasted the people who had kidnapped him and said, you're Muslims. You're degrading Muslims by doing this. And in fact, you people should convert to Catholicism. Well, finally they had enough, and the leader of the group shot him in the head. But when that guy was apprehended later, even he said he was amazed by how courageous this young seminarian was. And we can only imagine how many other people go through the same sort of thing. Here's another case that's quite interesting. Father Vincent Machosi. He was a native of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I remember that if ISIS is moving down into these different places, they love any area that is in chaos. Nigeria is Nigeria. Democratic Republic of Congo is some of the more chaotic of Central African countries. And Machosi was a priest, a very interesting man. He came to study here in the United States. He was at Boston University doing a PhD in, I think, ecumenical theology or something like that. And he realized that circumstances were so bad that he had to go back to the Democratic Republic of Congo and try to do something. So you can see, he's there with the kids and with some of the adults here. He was a very charismatic figure. People up in Boston absolutely loved him. He was this sort of cheerful guy. And he knew when he was going back to the Democratic Republic of Congo that he would be in trouble and probably die. But he chose to do it anyway. And so what happened, as often happens in these circumstances, he started a online documentation service about who was being kidnapped, killed, raped, etc., in the villages that he was familiar with. And of course, the radicals didn't like this at all. And although he's sometimes called in secular circles a human rights activist, it's clear from his whole life that he's the kind of person who was doing this out of a commitment to his religious faith more than anything else. So he was assassinated on March 20, 2016, which was Palm Sunday that year. We just had 51, did I mention this before? I mentioned the 51 that were just killed in Palm Sunday, yeah. So dangerous was the situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo that he was an Assumptionist priest. And the Assumptionists told him not to identify as an Assumptionist because there are 150 Assumptionists in the Democratic Republic, and they thought that it would bring down a bloodbath on the entire religious order if he were to identify as an Assumptionist. So he did all this kind of on his own steam, reported on it, put these things online. And when he died, 30,000 people showed up at his funeral. So you want to be inspired, you think about that, 30,000 people showing up for the funeral of someone who the local radicals have singled out to kill. There it is. Now, I could go on and talk about Southeast Asia, but I want to save a little bit of time, but just say that this sort of thing has moved out to Asia as well. It used to be, I quote in the book, there was a former Malaysian diplomat who said that when he was growing up, that Malaysians and Indonesians and Muslims and Catholics and Jews and Protestants all got along. It was kind of like what some of us remember as pluralistic America back before the troubles that we've had over the last couple of decades. But even he was shocked by how radicalized Muslims in that part of the world had become. And they're playing the same tune. They're talking about a caliphate, they're talking about internationalism, and something to keep an eye on because almost no one does. So again, I want to say, if any of you are involved in this, it's worth trying to draw some attention to it. I want to just look at from Asia. This is in Pakistan. This is Asia Bibi. Some of you probably have heard of her. She was condemned to death for alleged blasphemy. This is a charge that in Pakistan in particular is a problem because what people do is they accuse somebody of blasphemy and therefore they can take over their land or take over their property. So some of the people, some of her neighbors got into a tussle with her, accused her of a blasphemy against the prophet. She was condemned to death. In Pakistan, what goes on is usually the lower courts condemn somebody, they let a few years go by, and then the high court comes along and says, well, the evidence really isn't strong, and they let it go. It's a pattern that has happened over and over again in Pakistan, and one that the US government has got to put some pressure on so he would just stop. She was defended, and he himself was assassinated by Shahbaz Bhatti, famous guy in that part of the world, who was a Catholic, and from his earliest days in college, was a defender of minority rights. In fact, he was so committed to all of this that when the Pakistani government started a ministry for minorities, he became the first minister of minorities. He defended Asia Bibi and many others as well. And of course, the upshot was he was assassinated at one point for defending them on his way to work. A very interesting figure. His parents were Catholic. He was Catholic. His brother is a doctor who's been working in Rome. And the kind of figure that I think all of us should be aware of as someone in our time who did the right thing in some very difficult circumstances. Now, I'm going to close with just some very quick remarks about something I don't think many of you would consider would exist in a book like this, but I wanted to put into my book in particular. And that is the growing threat of martyrdom and persecution in the West. I have some friends who run out of Vienna what's called the Observatory on Intolerance and Discrimination Against Christians in Europe, OIDAC, it's called. And using Europe's own official criteria for what constitutes a hate crime, a crime against a person's religion, they document every year hundreds of cases in Europe. I think it was 700 in 2023. I think over 800 in 2024. And what they're talking about is not just sort of, pushing and shoving. They're knife attacks. They're, people getting run over by trucks, people being intimidated in the streets in France, in Spain, even in England. We see this these days. I've got this case. I'm sure many of you know Father Jacques Hamel, who had his throat slit about 8 years ago. And he was just saying Mass. He was in his 80s, harmless priest. He had maybe 5 people at Mass in Normandy. Two young guys came in who had been radicalized as Muslims, cut his throat, stabbed a couple of the people in the pews. And the Pope and all of Europe was horrified by this, and the Pope immediately called him a martyr, although it's hard to figure out which category it is when you're just there and someone comes in and cuts your throat. Because he didn't really feel as any threat. He was actually friendly with the local imam, but it's just that kind of random violence that is occurring more and more, even in Europe, particularly with knives, because guns are harder to buy in Europe than they are here, to say the least. So he's a case that all of us know about, but there are others in France right after that. And this was after that terrible attack in the Bataclan Theater in Paris, and others, Charlie Hebdo. I think there were 3 Catholics stabbed in Nice a couple of months after this, and there were similar things. So these things exist even in our westernized societies. France documents at least 2 religious buildings a month are destroyed within France. It could be arson. It's usually Islamic arson. It could be so-called accidents. It could be anti-Catholicism by non-Muslim forces. But 2 buildings every month, month after month after month, and to the point that France actually budgets several million euros every year to try to protect religious sites. In fact, Notre Dame was ready to be reopened, after that horrible fire in Paris. And the French police stopped a planned attack to burn it down again by some Muslim radicals in Paris. So you can imagine. I've got lots of other similar examples. I want to talk about the English-speaking world, though. In our world, we don't quite have the same degree of immediate threat as I think they have in the European continent. But if you look at England, where there are people being arrested for praying outside of abortion clinics, not even praying out loud, right? Praying to themselves. There have been a couple of them recently. And there was a case that I came across as I was doing this research of 3 or 4 young guys were carrying they were not Muslim, they were carrying a paperback edition of the Quran into school. They were sort of in the British Midlands. And somehow, you know how kids are fooling around, they dropped it. And, well, the story got around their school that they had deliberately defaced the holy book. This caused an uproar. They were expelled from school. The local police got involved. The local imam said, well, we need to be respectful. This was an error. But it's the kind of thing, these are the kind of blasphemy charges that you expect to hear about in Pakistan, but not in England, not in central England. And I think we're going to see more of that. So I think we need to be aware of this, very much aware of it. Here in North America, we're not immune to this either. Our Catholic bishops did a survey a few months ago about anti-Catholic attacks between 2020 and 2024, and there were 400 of them around the country in 3-4 dozen states. And I'm talking about arson, vandalism, attempts to actually burn tabernacles, etc. These are serious things that we need to pay attention to. I would even say that the situation up in Canada after that false report, I'm sure many of you know about this false report that there were mass graves outside these government-run schools that were run by Catholic and other religious bodies. Well, 30 churches were burned in Canada as a result of that. And Justin Trudeau said, it was wrong to do that, but understandable. This is utterly preposterous to say these sort of things. It's not understandable. It's a wrong reaction in a society that tries to be respectful of everyone's religion. And so I just want to say that there's a last chapter in my book that I deliberately put there. I'm sure it's going to be quite controversial, but there is a creeping kind of anti-Christianity, anti-Catholicism in our societies as well. And that we should all be aware of this and work to counter this attitude. Because I think one of the reasons why Western elites don't pay much attention to martyrdom and persecution elsewhere, even though hundreds of millions of Christians are under threat of persecution and martyrdom, is that our elites kind of think that Christianity has a bad history. It's not all that great a thing and maybe doesn't deserve all that much protection anyway. I think that's one part of it, frankly. I'm putting it fairly baldly. But I think that the other part of it is that lots of people in our society kind of think that it doesn't exist here. And it does. It just not only exists around the edges, it actually exists in government policies, as we've seen, in attacks on the Little Sisters of the Poor and whatnot. So all of us, and I mean all of us, have to be vigilant about this and respond when it happens. When we see anti-Semitism, we respond to it. When we see anti-Muslimism, I think we should respond to that as well. But we should also take care of ourselves, but not only for our sake, but for the sake of those hundreds of millions that I've been talking about of Christians around the world. These are people who daily live with persecution, and all too often they die as martyrs. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Royal. That was an incredible talk. Oh, excuse me. We'll now go with a few questions and answers. Just raise your hand and Colleen will approach.
Thank you. Good evening, Dr. Royal. Thanks for being here. We love seeing you on EWTN. As you were speaking, a name that crossed my mind was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Lutheran pastor during the Nazi reign in Germany in 1930s and 40s, training the next generation underground in secrecy. At some point he was in New York City in safety and felt he had to go back, knowing what might happen to him. And it did happen, and he died in a concentration camp about a week before the war was over. So we know the Protestant understanding of sainthood is different from ours. What is the Catholic position on martyrs who are not Catholics, who are Christians dying for the faith, but outside the Catholic Church?
Well, if you had asked that question 50 years ago, I think we could say exactly what it is. And I think it would just say that the church doesn't pronounce about people outside of Catholicism. You may recall that there were, 71 Orthodox Christians were executed on the beach in Libya a few years ago, and Pope Francis added them to the Roman martyrology. So he recognized, you could argue that the Orthodox are kind of Catholics, but just under a different jurisdiction. But he was willing to recognize officially inside the Roman martyrology that they could be thought of as martyrs. And he even said that, we can be ecumenical about many things, and this is a matter of an ecumenism of blood. So I don't know. I mean, I think Bonhoeffer was a great heroic figure, a saintly figure in a way. But I think that that's one you have to address to Rome, and let me know if you get an answer.
Okay, I think one more question.
So you mentioned these three categories, but you mentioned the three categories of people who are eligible to be declared martyrdom, but I wasn't clear. Is there like some commonality? You seem to suggest that this priest, who was clearly singled out because he was a priest, but was just saying mass and had his throat slit, that was surprising to you that he had been declared a martyr. Is it the case that someone has to be confronted with the choice of their religion or else death and then choose their religion? Is that the bright line that determines who's a martyr and who's not, or could you clarify?
Yeah. Well, I mean, let me say again, I have no power to declare anybody anything, So, this has to be declared by. But that said, I imagine Pope Francis immediately called him a martyr and then said that his image should be disseminated throughout Europe and he should be honored and whatnot. Now, there's a difference between him and Father Gagni, who was in an immediate threat. I mean, knew he was in an immediate. And people start mailing you bullets. I think you're under an immediate threat. Is it the case that France is so far gone with this overwhelming Muslim population that it seems to have in some places that saying mass is actually a dangerous thing? I mentioned the 3 people in Nice. Is going to mass a dangerous thing in France now? I don't think it's gotten to that point. So I don't know. Francis is the kind of guy who, out of emotion, will say something and then maybe it gets clarified later. Because to declare somebody a martyr, there's a whole series of things that have to be gone through. And similarly with the Orthodox that I was talking about, the ones that were declared part of the Roman martyrology. But there's a lot of this going around, and I think we're going to get more and more clarity on it as we start to see what's happening. Hadley, you have something?
Well, it was kind of depressing, though uplifting. Uplifting. But no, this matter of since October 7th, this something in my lifetime is different. After the war, I mean, I was born at the time when the Nazis were on the move. But after the war, I mean, discrimination against the Jews was really discrete things in hotels and firms and so on. But it was really, we didn't have crowds coming out proclaiming the right to kill Jews without moral restraint as something that was disreputable, no longer. But it's going. But the attacks on the church and upon pro-lifers, this has been going on for a long while. But what else is feeding this for the protests on the campus? The anti-Semitic attacks. These are clearly driven by pro-Palestinian groups. But there's been a persistent, extensive attack on synagogues. And Bob, do you have any sense of what else is driving this apart from the Islamists?
I don't know. I think that there's kind of a global, what should I call this? I mean, there's a global anti-Western radicalism that has played into the Islamic caliphate narrative. And Israel, let's face it, is part of the West. Judaism is part of the West. It's just as troubling as the situation is there, and we could have a long debate about that. It reminds me of something that Father Schall, our dear friend Father James Schall, who lived and taught at Georgetown for many years here, said, and I quote him in the book, he says, the things that we regard as beyond the pale morally, suicide bombing, attacking innocents, all that sort of stuff, in certain Islamic circles are not regarded as human rights. They're not regarded as sacred. That the desire for the caliphate trumps, other things. It's kind of like that, that radical atheistic communism, that totalitarianism. So, we can understand why certain people think that in Palestine, but why is there that sympathy here? That's the thing that is a puzzlement to me, that there seems to be an awful lot of just ordinary American young people on college campuses, maybe because they hear a lot of it in class, I don't know. But there's some anti-Western element as well as an anti-Christian, and anti-American. A lot of when you see some of the justifications, like for the suicide bombing, they just say, well, that's all well and good, but you Westerners are imposing yourself on us. And so they have a right to hit back at whatever soft targets they choose. And they can be churches. Sometimes you see coordinated. I think there was a case in India a few years ago where two Catholic churches and one Anglican church were attacked at the same time that a Western hotel was attacked. So it was kind of both the religious and the secular, anti-Western secularism. But I don't know. I mean, it's a deep question that you ask, and who knows? Yeah, ma'am.
One more question for this lady here.
You mentioned one priest, a martyr, where like 30,000 people came to his funeral. And that reminded me of a of something that somebody said one time, that the church was built on the blood or on the seed of the early martyrs. I don't really recall who said that. So meaning that with all the martyrs and witnessing their bravery, that there happened a lot of conversions. And we know this at least from the first 3 centuries, right? So I wonder if there's any record or any research or anything known that after those martyrdoms, people were shocked and were inspired by the bravery and by these, especially young priests or not priests, that there happened conversions after that, even within from the Muslims, you probably don't know, but if that happened. So do you know anything about that?
Well, I mean, we all have read about the record number of conversions and baptisms in France this year, for example. And the same is true in England. And there seems to be something, especially with young people, something's happening out there. One of the things, you can't mention everything from a book, and even the book doesn't cover everything that there is out there. But one of the things I learned when I met with this group in Vienna for the first time, that does at the Observatory of Anti-Christian Activity in Europe, is that they are also tracking about 10,000 people who are converts from Islam to Christianity, who don't dare give their names, but they very, very carefully approach priests in France, religious bodies, religious orders, and that no one knows how many people there are. And you can't crow about this because it could cause serious damage to these people. I mean, a lot of them would be dead. But there seems to be a category of people out there who, as you rightly say, they react like the early church. It was Tertullian, by the way, who said the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. He was a North African theologian in the 4th century. But we don't know about that. I mean, we hear crazy stories like there are 1 million Christians in Iran who are secret Christians because they don't dare pop their heads up because of the way the regime is. I don't know if that's true. I don't. To me, it doesn't seem possible, but lots of things God does don't seem possible. We'll probably, excuse me. I can't answer this question. We'll probably hear more about it, though, in the future.
Well, thank you, Dr. Robert Royal. That's one way to end a talk, but he will be outside signing his new book and another edition that's out there too. So feel free to purchase a copy from Kevin. Please join the CIC for our daily masses, confessions. We have a confession palooza on Holy Thursday and Good Friday from 11 to 1 p.m. So come on by if you're in the neighborhood, and we just wish you a very blessed Paschal Triduum and a happy Easter. So God bless you. And one other thing, sign up for our Eucharistic procession on Saturday, May 17th. There'll be another turn around this neighborhood for prayers for the country and for all the martyrs. Thank you, Dr. Royal. May I walk you outside?
Let me put this in there.
Sure.